of course, is the basis where obviously we're looking at paddocks that are typically crop and pasture paddocks, but obviously there's mobs in those paddocks. So the next thing we're turning on is just the basis of the mob movement layer. And Chris is going to talk a little bit just about in terms of mob movements and so on. So as an example of that, there's a lot of content and a lot of history around soil testing. So getting the soil test histories relevant to the paddock, if you like, and be able to track those back through time is a really important part of that. So the starting job there, of course, was to import the historical soil tests. There's a little bit of a process that we need to follow because, as you know, SoilMate and Paddock Advisor over years were two separate programs that came from two different sources. So I'm just going to step in now for a few minutes just to sort of go through that process of what and where. You can see there that all of the analyte values, which is probably the lowest level that you'd want to go to, but of course we needed to import all of the historical data and the reference data first and then build the user interface layers on top of that. So the context of that one is this basis around just being able to, whether or not it was that, if I turn the nutrition layers on alongside that, for example, or the chemical layers, I can start to line those two things up side by side. So that's that bit in terms of the context of where and how we're taking that. So I'm just going to switch back over to the slides that I had and just sort of step through that a little. So the context of the first part, in terms of just unlocking all of the information that's in those plans, as well as have an easy way or an easy means of being able to see the actuals at any point in time just by switching between plan and actuals mode in the top there. So going on from there, just a little bit of other background as well. There's been a lot of questions coming through about weather stations and sort of where that is, where that's coming from, and so on, and where that's going. So we had a weather expert basically provide us the integration capability to bring in all of the public sites from a reference data perspective that we could identify. So you can see there's currently 1,342 sites there as of this morning, and we're adding more as they come along. So the real basis there, and part of the discussion, is there's a lot more activity around on-farm weather station, on-farm telemetry. So the likes of Goanna Telemetry or the likes of Oz Forecast or those different suppliers around the country. So the next level of activity that we're working through as we speak is starting to then bring those, that next layer. So all the BOM sites are there, all of the regional DPI sites. So you can see in WA, there's a truckload of those because DAFRA in WA have 150 odd weather stations that they publish. So just a bit on that. If you've got particular suppliers of weather stations that you would like to see integrated, email those supplier details through and then we can start those discussions. It does require obviously the weather station provider to have a good, when they're publishing their information up into the cloud, to actually have the method and means in place for us to be able to integrate those across. And thereafter you can configure those two farms and paddocks to be then automate that process. Our great interest in that stuff is we want to record every millimetre of obviously rainfall that goes on a paddock or a farm, so that at the end of the season we can calculate things like water use efficiency pretty quickly and accurately. The same as we want to see the application of every nutrient application go on the paddock, so at the end of the season we can automatically calculate things like nutrient use efficiency. Chris can talk to some of those things in his piece as well as he talks through that. So the context of the initial goals, we've covered that. So, very basic to start with. It was really about just getting a platform in place where you could create boundaries against client files that may not have had them in the past. It was certainly about unlocking the information and then the very basic integration with NDVI. In a subsequent session, probably next week or the week after, we'll show you the work we're currently doing with the data farming integration. You can see there on what Mel was saying before, on this data farming site, you can see what the cloud cover mask is for any particular day and be able to just obviously avoid the days or the passes where the cloud cover is interfering with the quality of the image. In the first integration, we didn't have that from the data farming side, and we do now, and we're rolling that out shortly, and that will overcome, I think, what we're seeing there were all those cloud mask issues. The next part is changing the way we work effectively to be map driven. So things like instigating sample origination, so starting a soil sample directly from the map by dropping a data pin and ordering a sample from there. And of course, really big thing for us is this notion of bringing mixed farming operations. So seeing crops and livestock in the same view. So I might have the chem layer turned on so I can see what applications have gone on a paddock at the same time as I'm planning a mob movement to understand whether there's any issues that I might need to be aware of in terms of withholding periods and so on. So we now are in this phase where we're really finishing off the work that needs to be done. So this thing's useful for crop management for 2020, and then obviously that ongoing pieces of work. So I spoke before about the soil test side. I've just put on the bottom left-hand side there. It didn't copy and paste as well as I would have liked, but the next thing we're doing there is in the screen at the moment, you can see the red dot. The red dot's changing very shortly to be interactive. So Chris Dowling, from his perspective, chose the, if you like, the key elements that we want to be able to monitor regularly as being NPKs, pH, organic carbon percentage. So the basis of those being the things that at a first glance, if you like, you want to be able to drill into a paddock, and they're selectable. They're selectable by the type of analyte you want to measure them by, and the context of just making it a lot quicker and a lot easier to be able to sort of do that monitoring and see from the context. So if you really wanted to drill the detail, you're probably looking at that image, the widget, as I call it, on the left-hand side most of the time, but of course you've still got all of that historical soil test information or plant tissue test information sitting just immediately beneath that that you can turn on and off as you need to. The process that I spoke of in terms of some alignment is because the original back paddock platform that originated out of Western Australia so many years ago, alongside the SoilMate program, there's a one-time process, and we've built a simple application to do it, just to, if the paddock, farms and paddock naming structures in SoilMate were to differ for whatever reason with Opterra, then it's a means of just lining those up in the first instance. So by client file, you just go through and check any mismatches, line those up so that, of course, we can then automate that process of knowing that an historical soil test is going to appear, obviously, in the correct farm and paddock that it belongs to. So that's something that we'll be working with you on over the next, over the coming weeks to make sure that that process goes in place. Of course, the other side of it from a Western Australian perspective is there was a traditional basis of being able to upload soil tests, and there's new methods, much faster, simpler methods, that if the soil test didn't originate in SoilMate as they would have on the East Coast, then there's a means of being able to get that historical stuff up into the thing. And there's a nominal upload fee for that, if you like, and it's and we're building a new model that's based on per analyte, so it's to be cost effective. And the next point, and if we have any questions on this as we go forward across into Chris's section, there might be a bit of overlap, is that there's a massive amount of reference data available to us collectively around soil constraints and other, I guess, indices as far as soil health is concerned. So there's a whole bunch of public sector information available. In this instance, that relates to some work we're currently doing in North Queensland around the Queensland Reef Act legislation around soil constraints and so on else. And again, Chris might even just sort of spend a minute or two sort of discussing that. But we also know that there's massive amount of reference data. So in terms of the longer term basis of, I guess, first job was to match up soil chemistry and make sure that your access to that historical test data was available. I guess beyond that, there's a whole world of opportunities that we have as far as soil physical characteristics, soil biology and so on, in terms of driving a longer term agenda around soil resilience and what Chris calls elasticity in the production cycle. Soil is obviously the absolute fundamental asset as far as agriculture is concerned, and it's an area where we see tremendous opportunity, but you have to have these types of platforms in place to be able to do that. So a bit of a snapshot there in terms of the type of stuff that we're able to do. And you can see there that might be soil depth or salinity or sodicity, or there's just a whole world of opportunity there. Okay, moving on from there, I wanted to do a quick announcement about CloudShare and Opterra. So I'm pretty sure that all of you would be using Dropbox or iCloud or OneDrive or one of those online secure file storage facilities as a means of being able to share client information. So I guess the quick description there is all of the information that you enter into Opterra or any of the agricultural platforms, we call that structured data because it lives in a particular form in a database. But the truth is there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you need to necessarily store as a record, as part of the overall farm record. That's what we call unstructured data. So that's PDFs and Excel spreadsheets and Word docs and images and so on else. So the challenge with OneDrive is two things. You create a structure that basically maps most times or matches the same sort of client file, farm and paddock structure that you might have in the management platform. But that's a manual process to maintain. So we wanted to achieve two things. We wanted some basis that was going to be pretty straightforward to use, as a words, just as easy as Dropbox or anything else. There where you could link documents to a farm if it's at that level, or a paddock and zone level as relevant to it. So it might be that there's a SARDI Predictor-B report that lives as a PDF document, and you just want to link that directly to the paddock it belongs to and the year it was referenced, so that back from the same mapping engine, you've got access to that document library that lives beside it. The actual first piece of that is already there in the mapping thing. You can see reference if you're in there to document. So we're just going through this phase of integrating what we call the user interface. In other words, just tidying that up so that the connection between the two. The great thing about it is, though, that we didn't build that from scratch. We're using there, you can see there, a thing called Nextcloud. And it's another one, it's very similar to Dropbox or those other platforms. And we can use that to build what we need to on top of it. But you can also use it as a means of, or as an alternative to any of those others. So there's already applications for iPad or iPhone or your desktop computer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you could be pulling that through and using that as a means of, I've been using it lately where I'll get an email come through. It has a document, has an attachment in the email that I say, righto, that's actually relevant to that farm and paddock. So I'll just drop it from a desktop computer using my Windows Explorer to put it straight into the right file structure. So if I looked at that from the web view, you can see there that we create a structure, crops and pastures, e-learning, livestock, photographs, images, just so that there's already a structure there ready to go. But the basis is that at a client file level, we think that's going to be pretty useful. Again, we're doing this work to do that, the integration of it so that it appears into the Opterra mapping section the way it's meant to. And you can see there from my desktop, that's exactly what it looks like. So it's something that, in other words, it'll be very familiar to you. You could be just copying files into that, and then they in turn become part of the sync process. Okay, we're going to switch gears and hand across to Chris. I'm just a couple of minutes over. Without getting into the detail of thing, I just want to do a very quick introduction over 2 minutes. First thing is, of course, in large-scale mixed farming operations, there's obviously quite a structured process alongside the crop and pasture management as to how we plan for and create feed for the animals. And those two things sort of start at the beginning of the season together. They go off into their different loops, if you like, but then come back in terms of end of season. So it all comes down to performance per 100 mil of rainfall or per millimetre of rainfall at a farm and paddock level, whether we're reviewing that as crops and or livestock. So without getting into the detail of that, I just want to reference there's a very much a structure that we're building to in behind that. A couple of things about feed budgeting. Feed budget tools in the past were quite generic. They generally relied on a percentage of body weight gain. All the animal nutrition specialists will tell you that's absolutely true for about 5 weeks of the year in the flush of the season. So the basis of being able to model that out, firstly at the beginning of the season on a somewhat coarse basis, using obviously expected deciles or terciles, etc. And then later in season being able to restate that on a seasonal basis, and then effectively or moving towards the basis of then being able to define that down into individual animal feed rationing type tools as well. So there's a body of work going on and behind this, albeit what you're seeing in the front end that you see now is again very basic. So Chris is going to cover a little bit of that off today. And that was all premised around this notion that based on the food on offer, it's the quality of the tucker that makes such a difference. So and there's some models that Chris and our animal nutrition specialists that are based around the country that have been consulting to us on this stuff have been defining. So Chris will cover that off in a bit of detail at a relatively high level. The main thing is that we learned very early in that the agronomist, particularly the improved pasture agronomist in those operations, has the keys to the car to really driving the production that's needed to provide the animals the feed they need at the right times of season and in the right grazing format. So the actual ME to NDF ratios are exactly where you want them. And that leads into other things that Chris will sort of cover off just a bit today. The basis of livestock mob management. So you'll see there that we're starting to just give you the ability now over the next wee while, over the next 30 or 60 days, to be able to come in and define your primary and grazing mobs. And Chris will describe what we mean by that. And, of course, that context of being able to move those around the farms, apply animal health and veterinary treatments to them, etc. So I'll hand across to Chris at that point, and by giving him host control and let him pick up initially on just the very basics of the livestock side. So setting up mobs and initial planning and so on. So just a second, and I'll see where Chris and so Mel is host. Reclaim host. Over to Chris and make host. Unmute Chris's mic and you should have the floor, Chris. And I can see your screen.
See my screen?
Yes, I can. Yep. So I'll mute out.
Okay, thank you. Morning all. Changing tack and moving over to the livestock side of things. And I suppose it's a big area to tackle, and we've been at this probably for nearly 3 years now to get to the stage where we are to move in and not only create something for livestock, but do it in a way that it is relevant to mixed farmers and manageable from a point of view of people using our software, not being too bamboozled by how it all might work. So from the planning point of view, we based on feedback and survey from the majority of our customers, they told us that they were still using, by and large, the desktop application to do the most heavy lifting of their planning. So rather than necessarily start the livestock planning over in the new Opterra area, we started it in Advisor. And the planning being the ability to, I suppose, produce a gross, well, the things we produce for cropping, like lists of materials and chemicals that we're going to need to treat the animals, doing gross margins and parametric gross margins on what, based on our plans, we might be looking at as far as the economics. Producing a cash flow report for the whole farm rather than just the cropping enterprise, the integrated cropping with livestock, to see you know, what the effect on cash flow was of both of activities. Having a look at the gross margins and trying to make decisions around, are we better off putting more livestock on or more cropping? Are we better off going to grain and graze rather than cropping and livestock separately in pastures and in cropping areas? So all of those things are sort of underlying the tools we're building, and we're still building for this project. So the starting point with all of this is to create, excuse me, a livestock plan. So in doing that, it's very much the same as I've got the farm plan here for, you can see, for sprays and operations and soil health for fertilizers, the fertilizer program. What we did is said, okay, well, you know, a mob is very similar on a whole farm enterprise, as you would say, is a paddock. So the whole thing was premised around that when we have a farm, we can set up, the process for setting up farm is to add new paddocks. So what we did is add a little icon over here called mobs. And if I turn that on, it goes into livestock mode. So there's no separate program. It's just using the same sort of logic and the same process. So what I do here is I can now add a new mob. So, and the idea is to set up some of the characteristics of the mob we're going to need. One, just to identify them, but two, the idea behind this was to set it up so if we want to go over into feed budgeting, a lot of the information, particularly about the animal's likely consumption rate and its energy requirements, are already inherent in what we've set up in describing the mob. So at this stage, you know, in setting up a mob, you know, I just add, I give it a mob start date. Give it a description, which is an open you know, we're suggesting people use ear tag colours as mob names, because it's probably common for most farmers to do that, because that describes what year they were dropped and it keeps them generally together. But it can be a mixture. You can have a mixture. It's really whatever you want goes in there. So in setting that up, I just add a mob class. So these are sheep. So this is everything's in the drop-down menus. Stock class, 15 kilo lamb, numbers 100, opening weights 15 kilos because we've nominated that as target sale weight 30 kilograms, target disposal date. We put in, it calculates the DSE, we can put a value in, we can keep an idea of the breed and the purpose. These are for sale. Some of these things are important as to whether you put in its purpose or sale at breeding, because later on in the feed budget area, when we are feeding the animals that progressively gain weight over time, so it's an active monthly time step feed budget. When they reach the 30 kilos and the purpose is sale, it will exit them from the platform or tell you what date that's expected to happen, and it will exit them from the platform. In other words, the feed that they would have consumed from there forward is now available to the rest of the herd. If it's breeding, then obviously we're not going. They're going to continue on after they on the farm for a fair period of time while they're in breeding, in the breeding platform. So they just continue on consuming all year till in 1 year, we decide that that mob or individuals from that mob are now for sale, and you know, we give them a disposal date. So I'll put these ones down as sale. And the other thing that we can do at this stage is allocate them to paddocks that they're likely to go through. Now, we decided not to go into a really detailed grazing plan by saying these animals are going to be in these paddocks on these dates, because that's probably clearly unrealistic over a 12-month period. But if we've got some ideas that I know the creek paddock's got some lucerne in it, and I want to get these things up to weight quickly. I know the cropping trend paddock's got wheat in it. They're going to go through those, and I can allocate them either one paddock or all of the paddocks, and that tells us what feeds available to them across the period they're going to be with us. So that's set up the mobs, and largely that's about establishing the mobs so that we can then allocate to them the type of management inputs and operations we're going to produce. So from there we jump over to the home tab, and another little icon up here, livestock, which takes it out of just cropping mode and puts it into livestock mode. And you can see now I've got the mobs on farm sitting here that I can click on them, or I can even go and see which mobs are going through which paddocks. So they're under both structures, but I'll just leave it here. The lambs, at this stage I don't have a program for them, but you can see the bulls here. I have an animal health program, I've got a supplements program, or I've got operations. If I had supplements, we can put them in there. Individual beasts, what we have set up in the database underlying this is that each of the individuals that is in that mob has the opportunity at a stage in the future where we link to an individual animal recording system, the True Test or the Gallagher or those, which we have plans to in the future. Then all of the mob records are actually stored against individuals. So once we start to identify them, at least the mob records will go with them as to what was applied. So we're not burning all of that history. Each of those individuals, those 10 bulls, are getting this for this year. So the way to set up an animal health program is, if it's one that's familiar to you, you've got the opportunity of scenarios, just like you have with crops. And the scenario contains an animal health program, a supplements program, and linked operations, and production. So it brings all of those across. But in this case, I don't have, for the lambs, I don't have a scenario. So the quick way to do it is in the animal health tab, just it would be with a spray program, a fertilizer program. We've loaded this with all of the AVPMA products that you might need. And I might put on, let's say, put on some Panacur French. We give it a rate. One of the things that is in there, and just a quick warning, we haven't put a units conversion model underneath this as yet. So as with cropping, everything's based on kilograms and litres. So apologies initially that if a vaccine is at 0.002 or 2 mils per head, you're going to have to put in 0.002. But we will take care of that later. So the units per head in this case is units per head, sorry, dollars per unit. I've got them back to front. I'll just, so that's 20 mils per head, and this is say $120 per litre. Require 2 litres. The target, we can put in what the target pest might be, in this case roundworms, timing, post weaning. So we've tried to make sure that all of the weaning date AVPMA numbers there at a time not too distant future, just with the with the cropping. By clicking on that, it'll be a hot link to the label for the product, so you'll be able to check and put in withholding periods and all those sorts of things, or you will have available the withholding periods for when you do recommendations, and the supplier and the notes. So that's you know, that's animal health. Supplements. Once again, if we want to apply supplements, there's a whole heap of the main Australia-wide distributor products in there, and also silos for you to be able to manage your own on-farm production of things like lupin grain or lucerne silage or lucerne hay. I'll put some weaning, cost per unit, $1. Number of units, half a kilo units, sorry. Dose unit 0.5 number of days I'm going to feed them for, 60 the amount required. It calculates that out, and when do I want to start doing that. Operations, once again, just a quick feeding, hand feeding, auto feeding, feeding out blocks, feeding. So I'll just go auto feeding details. Cost is sort of $50. Weaning, date 28, link type, so I can link it to my animal supplement. Link product, lucerne hay, and we can put a symbol in there as can for cropping. For production, if we're going to sell the lambs, we've got a whole heap of different things that we can classify it as that makes sense to us about what we're selling. Product type. Now, the reason for specifying this is because there's different calculations as to the way we calculate the value of meat, milk and wool. So in this case, it's milk. Sale date, I think I had over here somewhere. Sales number, 100. Kilograms production, I buy 30 kilo per head. Production variance 10%. I'm going to sell them at 27 through to 33 kilos when they get in that weight range. Sales units is in kilograms. I'm going to sell a total number of kilograms. So I'm expecting to sell 3,000 kilograms of live weight, and the dollars per kilogram. In this case, so I go 5, 6, 7, and what that's doing down here is giving you an idea of what the expected income is going to be. So the physical sales and what the income might be. This will feed back in. You'll notice there isn't a gross margins tab on here or a cash flow or an analysis tab. They're still yet to come, but they are in the process of evaluation. So once you've done that, then you've got the ability to actually print out once you've completed that, we have a report structure in here that can provide the same sort of details as we can for crops. So if you go through the section, you've got mob summaries, you can see what mobs and how many were in them, gross margins for different types, cattle, sheep, livestock paddocks, feed supplement summary, a feed supplement summary by month, animal health supplement. You can see we can have a look at the quantity per month, right down to mob details of the cattle and each of the mobs, what they might be costing and then what they're bringing. Just this in the same way as we've structured the cattle report. Sorry, the cropping report. So that's I suppose the setup of the plan, and obviously we can go into actuals mode and convert plan to actuals if we want to do it that way. Or there is an integration of the livestock into back paddock mobile where you can do recs in there for animal health, and we'll be very shortly starting the project of being able to put fulfillment of those recs in paddock book, so that those recs go across into paddock book and can be completed over there. But the next section, any questions, any feedback, anything that someone wants to sort of comment or ask a question about. So that's really just the start of the season, the setup, get an idea of the economics, the logistics that are required. The next thing, you know, I wanted to talk about was, okay, we take this data across and say, okay, have we got enough feed for these animals that we've got on the farm? Do we need to get rid of animals? If so, when? Do we need to convert more cropping paddock across into the livestock because it's looking pretty good versus crop prices? Or do we need to go the other direction? Do we need to sell off some stock early because there's a feed gap coming that we can't fill?
So Chris, everybody's muted. I've just dropped a note out to everybody via the chat section that that might be a way if they're comfortable to, if we want to fire any questions through to you as you're speaking, and we can collect those up and respond to them.
Yeah. The other one's to push the space bar because that'll let you talk.
Oh, heck, it does too.
Push the space bar down and use it like a microphone. While you've got it down, you can actually talk, and then when you let it back up, it'll mute you again, just so you don't forget. Okay, no one's going to be first, but please, if you've got a question, put it in the chat, and we'll respond to that if you don't feel comfortable speaking online. Okay, so I'm going to just minimise this. That has basically set up the plan for looking at the feed budget. And the feed budget is done over here in the Opterra site. The data that you've put into Advisor, when you sync it, comes across into this Opterra site. And we go to Opterra Livestock. You can see we've started the process of putting the planning process we have in BPAM in here as well, and you'll be able to plan in either place. But the one we're talking about here is feed budgeting, and as Chris said before, the active management is also in process of being programmed, and is not far off testing and rollout by early winter. But the feed budget is basically about creating that view of, given the plan that I've made, what does that look like in reality when I look at it from the point of the amount of material available to the animals and the number of animals I've got on the farm now. So I can look forward and decide to buy in feed, get rid of animals, or do something, or just change the emphasis on what's happening in the paddocks across the season. So I just add a plan. I select a trading name that I want to do the plan for. And one of the things you need to make sure is in Advisor, when you have a client file, you make sure you put the postcode in the contact details. And if you don't know how to do that, get in touch with the guys in the help and the customer support. They'll show you how to do it. I won't go through it now, because what that does is allows us to provide you with a set of, if you select, it selects which state you are in, and that flashes up a region. Now the region defines the feed types, and this will become clear when I start showing you how this works. But we define a region type that you're in. So in this case, I know this particular client file is in the Central Tablelands. I choose a date for the plan, and the livestock area that's available on the farm, and I save it. Now that sets up basically a scenario, and we can do this as you can see I've done this a number of times across the season because circumstances have changed on different cases, and I can look at these as different scenarios and save them. One of the things that you can do with this is set this up so that you know, we can look at different seasonal outcomes, because obviously when we do a plan now, we don't know what it's going to be like in December. But about 3 months out, we generally, the Bureau of Met are giving us some indications whether they're looking at a better than average winter or an average winter or whatever. So this has the flexibility to be able to cope with that and create another scenario. So the first thing I wanted to do is set up the paddocks, and provided we've synced that information that is over in Advisor across, I hit the plus and all the paddocks and their areas come across. Now, this process at the moment is a little bit clunky, and I will apologise at the moment for it in setting up the feed lists in these paddocks, but I can assure you we have another process that is one heck of a lot more automated in scope to change it. So what we've got to do is actually tell the model that's running the feed budget a little bit about these paddocks. What are we going to use? What's in them? And I know in this case, I just got to go through and say these ones are pasture. Now the way that we're going to change this is, rather than me adding pasture to all the paddocks got pasture in it, I will nominate pasture, and you'll just click all the paddocks that have got pasture in them, and they will be automatically allocated. So we're going to just take this step out and reverse it. I know the two different ones in here is that one has wheat in it, so it's got a grain and graze in it, and the creek paddock's got lucerne in it. So it's a pasture, but I need to and what this is doing is, if it's pasture, it's allocating all of the feed across the year to the grazing platform. If it's grain and graze, it's only allocating the biomass of the crop prior to Z31 across into it, because most people aren't going to grain and graze if they're truly trying to do a good job, allocate anything past there, because it'll probably hurt yield too much. So the next thing is the feed type, and this is controlled by the region you're in, and most of these paddocks are temperate grass and subclover. Now the data that runs this is actually the MLA grazing planning database. I'll just change this one so I remember. That one's winter. The creek paddock is actually lucerne. It handles them slightly differently depending on what crop it is. Now what this is setting up is the actually monthly distribution, and you can see it's actually populating over here the annual average dry matter. Now that's based on the Central Tablelands MLA standards for a decile 5 season. So it knows that. You have the ability to say, look, I know that paddock does better than that because it's my most fertile paddock, and I can change that. So if you've got more information about the actual production, you can put it in, and this one might be only 6,000 because it's a rocky paddock. The other thing is, and it doesn't make all that much difference. The dry matter start, dry matter min. Dry matter min is to make sure we're retaining as much ground cover as we can, and the given, I suppose, best management practice is somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 kilograms of dry matter needs to remain in the paddock to have 70% ground cover for erosion control and sediment runoff. So we've set it there, but obviously during the drought when things were pinched, you could drop this down to a lower level. If you want to be ultimately accurate, you could put in the absolute dry matter that's in the paddocks on the planting date, if you knew what it was, or just a rough estimate, because in reality, you know, the difference between there and there is only 500 kilos relative to the seasonal growth. It's not very much, so it makes it not a lot of difference, unless you know you really are starting with a very high dry matter. But I'll just for the sake of it, I'll put these in at 1,000 kilograms at the moment, all of them. Now the other thing I will do is I'll change that the drying starting dry matter. I'll start at 400, and the lucerne I'm happy to because it's irrigated in the creek paddock. I'm willing to drop that down to about 500. So now that I've set that up, I save it. And you can see it's now populating because the mob plan has come across. We now have the mobs consuming information. You can see here's the intake estimated. So green tag winner females. These are 350 kilo. They're eating about 7 kilograms per day. Breeding cows about 10. Bulls about 18 because they're about 800 kilos, and the green tag steers are about 8 kilos a day.
CD, just got a question coming through there, mate. So if you get the pasture tested, can you add the exact numbers in?
Yes, you can. So if you've got the pastures tested, what we can do is come into here to edit, and you can see I can overwrite that. Oh, sorry, that's 1,000. So if you got the pasture tested and it was 800 at the start, then you just save it, and then it'll adjust it. So it recalculates based on the 800 there now and the 1,500 target. So you know what that means is by the end of the grazing cycle, even though we produce 11,100 kilograms, we're going to sacrifice 700 kilos for ground cover at the end. So that won't be available for grazing. So you can see the total production is 11,000. We've got this figure here, adjusted available dry matter is 4,900 because we don't eat everything. And the tonnes available, which is the adjusted dry matter by the hectares. That's the tonnes of available grazing. So what that does is brings in, okay, with that that number of stock and that range of paddocks, and you can see I can open that up or close it down. You can see all the details there. Then I can start playing around with what if. Okay, so I can say, look, summer's been average, autumn's been average, but they're predicting a good winter, and I'm not sure about spring, so I'll leave it at average. And I can fiddle around with grazing management to start to affect the amount of feed supply or deficit that's coming along as a result of the difference there. So what we mean by average is generally I'm grazing, about on time. Good grazing is grazing at not the greatest dry matter, but at the highest level of ME and lowest dry matter for an optimization around the amount of material in the paddock. So we're trying to optimize the quantity and the quality. So a good grazier, say for ryegrass, an annual ryegrass pasture, will be grazing between 2.5 and 3 leaf stage, and they will consistently hit that, and they will hit maximum dry matter and maximum quality. We know that in periods where we've got large excesses, you can see here we've got a large excess that the feed's going to get away from us, and during that period our grazing may not be that good. So the surplus won't be there. So we can modify this by just the grazing management. I'd suggest you keep it on average to start with. So what this is saying is The seasonal surplus is we have a bit of an excess in summer. We've got a problem in autumn and spring, and in winter, and in in spring, we've got a reasonable excess. So what I can do is go and look at some supplementary feeds and say, look, during autumn I can feed them some stubble or straw that I bale that I might pasture hay I might bale, and when I get over here I'll keep some cereal hay to feed out in winter. And what it's doing is calculating the number of tonnes based on the metabolisable energy that's in these particular products. So it's adjusting the rate for the amount of energy that is actually required to fulfill that. The other thing we've put in there is your relative efficiency. I'm going to feed this out through hay racks, not just on the ground. So I'm saying they're 120% efficient compared to just throwing it on the ground. So it's actually adjusting the number of tonnes of hay that we actually need. Just to get another view of this, I can come over to the charts here and have a look at dry matter versus, and look at just when and how early this seasonal thing is starting off. So what we've got here is the dry matter demand, the total dry matter available. So, you know, we've got a bit of a problem here in July. If I look at what's required, and we've got a high period here because, you know, we've got animals gaining weight. We've started here in April. You can see it adjust to the planting date, and it's saying, you know, the animals that we're going to need feeding during that period to meet their performance criteria. And if we look at both of those together and look at the deficit, you can see the deficit months where it's below. So May, June, July, and into August, that's where the problem is. So we can decide at that stage, okay, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to shed animals early? Or are we going to fill that feed gap with hay? And we know the quantity because we've just calculated the quantity over here. This is the as is. We don't, at this stage, it's not integrated back into that feed we've actually nominated has not been put back into here to show the effect on the live weight. But notionally, what it should show is that feed we've put in should fill this gap. The other thing is we've got a surplus here. What do? Do we put more animals on? Or do we make conserve pasture hay there to feed back over here? And that'll be a choice or a discussion you might have. And that's the idea of this at this stage. The next stage after this, I suppose, is to go back and change, add in paddocks with more grain and graze. So you can come back to your plan and add in more paddocks. Or you can choose to plan to sell animals early. One thing I didn't show you is to get this to work, there is some, if I go back into cropping mode, you'll see there's a new tag here for livestock. If a paddock is going to be used for livestock, so if I've got another cropping paddock I want to bring in and see what the effect of grazing a wheat paddock right through, then all I got to do is find that paddock and click on livestock, and suddenly all of the dry matter for that will be allocated back into grazing. So I can go back over into here, and that paddock will show up, and then I've just got to configure it, and then it'll come back into the view here of the dry matter that's available. So you've got some other views in here. Here's the dry matter available by feed, so we can see the temperate pasture, how much is the lucerne supplying and when, and how much is the forage cereal supplying and when, to help understand, you know, what might feed the gap. So at this stage, the planning tool is a very, very coarse scan to show you where there are deficits, to try and help you understand what the options might be as far as carrying animals through, feeding them, allocating more land to that enterprise. after we've done that, I'll just save that off as a scenario. A lot of these things can be exported, so wherever you see this little, then this whole scenario with all the graphs can be, and you can print preview all of this as a PDF. So that's basically the reporting structure for this at this stage, is to be able to print these things out, you know, as you can with the charts. You know, there's an ability to export to PDF. As Chris said, the next phase after this, this was still in what we call planning phase. The next is to go into management phase. And that's starting to set up the primary mobs. As we suggested, that a primary mob is something that is, when an animal comes on the farm, it is brought in, that creates a primary mob. It's the unique identifiers that make that animal individual, so that we can track it later on. Grazing mobs are defined as just casual associations between animals that happen at a location and for a particular period of time. Now that can be for their entire life. So if you had a mob of ewes that were born the same year and they stayed together out of the same dam and sire, and they stayed together for the whole time they were on the farm, then their primary mob would become the grazing mob for the entire period. You might lose a few individuals through attrition, but or sales, but that mob could be the same. But generally, what happens is we end up with mixing and matching of primary mobs. We'll end up with aggregation of mobs that are breeding. It might become breeding ewes that have been born in 2014, 15, and 16. They get mixed together at joining and become a grazing mob. So what we're trying to do is, in that case, is identify them correctly so the records stay with them, and then we can start managing them. So from the managed mob perspective, what we're doing is the ability to put them in a paddock and then move them around and keep track of them over in the mapping tab. Ultimately, what happens in here will also be able to be done from maps. So you'll be able to click on a mob in a map, and it'll bring you through to here to tell you, or through other controls, to give you the ability to move them around and split them and do, you know, all of those things that would happen with managing mobs, the numbers and where they are and when they were there. So the things that it will do by doing this, it will actually, because we've got the chemical history as Chris has suggested, not only will we be tracking the treatment history of the animals, but we will be tracking the history of the paddocks that will be joined to those grazing mobs, so that any chemicals or fertilizer or anything that was added to that paddock will also track around with those individual mobs or animals. So we're sort of heading down the QA and the reporting for export, ESI reporting. Any questions? Any comments? I can't see. Where's the chat screen? That wasn't me falling over either. Okay, well, if there's nothing more.
Righto, well, I might just hand back over to this side for a second and just a couple of sort of closing remarks. So Christy is host. Reclaim host. Righto, so just a couple of things to wrap up, I guess. The comment, or one of the questions that I get asked the most is sort of where we sit, where does Opterra Livestock sort of sit within the broader market? It was pretty clear from our research over the last 2 or 3 years that the biggest issue was that in the first wave of digital agriculture, we built a whole bunch of applications, but we ended up with a whole bunch of applications where nothing talks to anything else. So we sort of talk now about this next wave of digital ag, where, you know, a lot of the energy and effort, particularly at the platform level, is going into sort of integrating different vendors. So Opterra, even when we launched it in its most basic form, had things like Oz Forecast supplying that weather information, and data farming supplying the very first of the spatial imagery information. But the key thing that came out of it was, from the livestock side, is we're not pursuing or looking to compete, if you like, against those specialist livestock management applications that are obviously far further developed and so on. What we discovered from a lot of the feedback from the primary producers themselves was, in the absence of having to use 2 or 3 or 4 different applications, a big chunk of them weren't using any and still aren't. So that's where we started. So we actually say our competitor in the market in this is for all of the people that aren't using anything in a mixed farming operation. So the truth is, vast majority of those will be receiving an agronomic service from somebody, whether it's a reseller or an independent consultant. And a lot of the structure that goes into planning, particularly in southeastern and southwestern Australia, that's quite formalised on the cropping side, is quite informal on the livestock side. And most often the market sort of analysis told us that the advisor, the agronomic advisor, isn't often involved in that discussion, that the livestock operations are run by the primary producer. So one of the things we're sort of, I guess, looking to do here is build this model where it makes sense for a primary producer to want to just use one platform to be able to do that, and starting, as you can see, at a pretty fundamental level. But, you know, the ability to know where my animals are, which paddock they're in, and those things that we do talk about in terms of being able to, I guess, start to really plan for optimising those operations. So the animals always, across a season, we know well in advance and are able to restate many times across a season just what tucker they need, and make sure that we're giving them the right quality, because quality and quantity is obviously a massive part of that discussion. So I reckon that's enough in that sort of first run through. A couple of things, if any of that's of interest and you want to sort of talk about it more in a more technical sense, then I put CD's email address there, or is contactable through obviously the switch, but certainly any sort of ongoing technical discussion. And bear in mind too, his background and experience in around soil health, because these two things are just indelibly linked. The other side of it is, if it's just more discussion around how to set it up or some ongoing one-on-one training or so on, that support is by far the easiest method to use. So look, pretty good turnout this morning. I hope you've gotten some value out of it. As you know, in the current times we're in, we just obviously are unable to travel out and meet face to face like we normally are. So we like, I guess, 1,000 others are reverting to this basis of using these webinars. But I hope that's been of value, and certainly we are looking for contribution, really looking for feedback on where you see we think we're getting it right, and where you see where you think we're not getting it right, because that's obviously more important than anything. Righto, everyone, thank you very much. On that basis, we'll, if there's no further questions coming through chat, or people would prefer to send that one-on-one, then I'll wrap things up. Righto, thank you, and see you again on the next call. Thank you.